It's a little-known story, yet one that has shaped our world. A tale of migrants and outcasts. The story of the millions of German-speaking Europeans forced to flee famine, freezing winters, religious persecution and wars to reach lands they knew nothing about.
A lot of Germans give up hope that things are going to be better. And they were forced into exile.
Im Ansiedlungsgebiet selbst
Once they arrived, the migrants faced major challenges.
große Herausforderungen gestellt.
The epic tale began in 1618 on the banks of the Rhine. It stretched across more than 3 centuries and 4 continents.
Migrant recruiters competed with each other throughout German-speaking Europe. They promised excitement, but most important, they promised a better life.
Thanks to the tireless work of historians, we can now rediscover the forgotten stories of these men and women. Stories that give names to those who migrated.
Many of them did not survive the journey.
Many felt abandoned early on.
They were effectively auctioned off.
For better or worse, they shaped the history of their new homelands.
On the back of the booklets from Germany was the motto, "Remember that you are German."
They were millions. Their stories shed new light on our shared past. After the pioneers of the previous century, German-speaking migrants became even more numerous throughout the 18th century. Fleeing war and poverty like the pioneers before them, they now came as peasants, missionaries, entrepreneurs, and simple laborers. Their promised lands lay in the Americas and North Africa. Together, they would have to find their place in these unfamiliar worlds. By the mid-18th century, the Rhine region had at last found peace, emerging from decades of religious wars. Yet winters remained cruel, epidemics just as deadly, and the harsh grip of the feudal system kept peasants shackled in servitude. A boss would be better than a lord, they reasoned, and so some left for the cities in search of factory work, while others opted for the colonies to try their luck. By 1750, the 13 English colonies of North America were already home to over 1 million inhabitants. German-speaking migrants formed the largest minority, nearly 100,000 strong, and still growing. The English grew increasingly resentful of their presence, criticizing their swelling numbers, their religious sectarianism, and their closeness to indigenous peoples. For governors and wealthy landowners, however, the thought of losing such a cheap workforce was unthinkable. A rare testimony from Württemberg in southwestern Germany, penned by Pastor Gottlieb Mittelberger, offers historians a vivid glimpse of the fate that awaited these migrants. In 1750, the Lutheran Church sent him to deliver an organ to the Church of New Providence in Pennsylvania, a chance for him to see for himself the famed land of tolerance he had heard so much about. But in his book, he revealed a grim and sobering reality.
On board the ships, terrible misery reigns. Stench, vomiting, fever, dysentery, boils and scurvy, all born from foul water and rotting food. Lice swarm in terrifying numbers, and many passengers die in squalid, pitiful conditions. Day and night, the air is filled with crying and wailing, sounds that could break even the hardest of hearts. People curse each other, some even kill each other. Children rarely survive the crossing. Parents often watch helplessly as their lifeless bodies are cast overboard. I myself fell gravely ill, so I know too well what these poor souls endure. When I recovered, I did what I could to comfort them with prayers. At the end of that long, punishing journey, the sight of land brought hope. Some wept with joy and sang praises to God. But their ordeal was far from over.
Mittelberger's testimony is all the more precious because he was a man of means. Unlike most migrants who came from very humble origins and couldn't write, he could put his story into words, and he did.
To secure their royalty to the British Crown, the authorities required each new German-speaking arrival to swear an oath to the King of England. Historian Annick Foucrier uncovered the archives that trace their journey, preserved in Philadelphia, in the old courthouse where the oath was once taken.
It was here, in this very room with its raised platform, that migrants stood and solemnly pledged allegiance before the provincial authorities.
We, late inhabitants of the Palatinate upon the Rhine and places adjacent, having transported ourselves and families into this province of Pennsylvania in hopes and expectation of finding a retreat therein, do solemnly promise and engage that we will be faithful to His present Majesty, King George II, and his successors, kings of Great Britain.
Once the oath was sworn, the men were led back to the ship, where a formal ship list was drawn up, each name signed. Among them, we can see the signature of Gottlieb Mittelberger. Those who had paid for their journey were free to disembark. But for the vast majority, the voyage had come at a price, a debt that now had to be repaid. The ship's captain placed ads in the local papers. Bells rang out. Those in need of workers came aboard, ready to negotiate contracts.
As a free man, Gottlieb Mittelberger looked on in horror as his fellow travelers met a grim and uncertain fate.
That was the moment when the trafficking of human souls truly began. English, Dutch, and even high-ranking Germans came aboard, selecting from the fittest migrants those they judged suitable for labor. Adults signed on to serve for 4, 5, even 6 years. The youngest were bound until the age of 21. Many parents, desperate to settle their debts, sold their children like livestock. Once disembarked, families were often torn apart, sometimes for years, sometimes forever.
This was the redemptionist system, debt paid back through labor. Migrants unable to cover their passage had borrowed from captains or merchants. Now they owed them years of their lives. The records are extraordinary. We can see the names listed alongside the number of years each was contracted to serve.
Most European migrants in America entered this system of indentured servitude. More than 200,000 people, many under 25, were placed at the mercy of masters who could beat or even resell them. Harsh conditions meant many never lived to see the end of their contracts. Gottlieb was determined to unmask the illusions spread by the so-called new landers.
Le terme lui-même, New Land, ça veut dire ceux qui
The term New Land referred to those who returned from the New World, essentially those returning from America, boasting of newfound wealth, like the proverbial rich uncle.
tout ce que sa réussite lui a apporté. Et de l'autre côté,
To the poor, it was a tempting tale. If he could make it, why not me?
et qui se disent pourquoi pas moi.
But the reality Mittelberger described was far darker. His fellow countrymen were not only living in squalor, they were also losing their faith, drawn towards temptation. Determined to protect the naive from such illusions, Gottlieb returned home.
When word spread among my compatriots that I was returning to Württemberg, many begged me to speak out about their miserable lives, so that not only peasants, but also princes and lords might hear the truth and stop other innocent souls from leaving their homeland. I swore before Almighty God to reveal the truth to the German people.
Back in Württemberg, the Duke himself urged Gottlieb to publish the account, to warn others, and counter the recruiters' false promises.
En 1754, il retourne dans les pays rhénans, dans le Württemberg.
In 1754, Mittelberger returned to the Rhinelands. By writing his book, he hoped not only to dissuade emigrants, but also to gain the Duke's favour.
Du duc de Württemberg.
For the Württemberg authorities, every migrant lost meant fewer workers and rising labour costs.
Et ça fait donc augmenter le coût de la main-d'œuvre. C'est un témoignage donc très fort.
His account remains a powerful testimony, widely used by historians, but it must be read with care. After all, it was crafted to deter emigration to America.
Partir vers le continent américain.
In the end, Gottlieb Mittelberger's book had little impact. Few migrants ever saw it, and the glowing promises of recruiters, far more numerous and seductive, won the day. Historians estimate that around the same time, around 7,000 German-speaking migrants set sail for Philadelphia every year. On July 4th, 1776, the 13 colonies of North America declared their independence, proclaiming it self-evident that all men are created equal. England, however, did not agree, and war swiftly followed. The American revolutionaries turned to France, England's great rival. King Louis XVI answered the call, sending military reinforcements across the Atlantic. Both France and England turned to the Rhinelands, where underused regiments offered a ready pool of manpower. Tens of thousands were conscripted. England drew heavily from the Hesse in the east, while France concentrated its efforts nearer home in the Rhine region. Armed with barrels of brandy and grand promises, French recruiting sergeants roamed village after village, seeking willing young men. The Palatine county of Zweibrücken, near Alsace, was the birthplace of a certain Daniel Flohr. His father, a peasant, died when Daniel was still a child, and at the age of 20, he faced an uncertain future. Then, in June 1776, he spotted a recruitment notice posted in his village by a French infantry regiment.
Brilliant youth who wish to enlist for 8 years in the Royal DuPont Regiment may contact the company captain, who will offer generous contracts. Enlistees will be taught for free, not only in the handling of arms, but also in the arts of dancing and writing.
This poster dates from the late Ancien Régime, the 1770s or 1780s, a recruitment appeal designed to entice young men to serve 4 or 8 years in the Royal DuPont Regiment.
Au service de ce régiment du Royal DuPont. Et la manière dont l'apprentissage du maniement
At first glance, the pairing of swordplay with dancing and writing lessons might seem odd. But for the nobility, this was tradition. Young nobles were trained in academies where courtly manners stood alongside martial skill.
Dans cette affiche, the
poster offered more than enlistment. It hinted at a path to social mobility and stability.
D'une certaine manière aussi de stabilité. C'est-à-dire que pendant 4 ou 8 ans, on savait qu'on serait nourri. On n'avait pas.
For 4 or 8 years, a young man would be housed, fed, and trained, and could hope to acquire a rise in social status.
Sociale supérieure à celle que l'on occupait avant de s'engager.
Daniel Flohr seized the opportunity. For him, the poster was a doorway to a better life. What he didn't yet know was that this journey would lead him to a land that would one day become his home. He enlisted in the Royal DuPont Regiment and sailed off to fight in the American War of Independence. Years later, he would recount his experience in a rare manuscript, a soldier's eye view of the war, seldom preserved in such detail.
Flohr's journal, which I'm lucky enough to have here, is a unique record. Long mistaken for a travelogue, it is in truth a soldier's chronicle of life inside the regiment. While studying the manuscript, we made the hypothesis that a drawing within it might be a self-portrait of Flohr, a man on horseback, sword in hand, dressed in a blue coat, matching the Royal DuPont uniform. Flohr's journal recounts the violent military engagements he survived, and including the Battle of Yorktown.
La bataille de Yorktown.
When we arrived at Yorktown, we began digging trenches, but scarcely had we started when cannonballs began to rain down on us. That night, there was not a moment of peace, not even 15 minutes. The fire was so intense it lit up the night sky as if it were day. My comrades screamed for help, falling one after the other like snowflakes. I thought Judgment Day had come.
The Battle of Yorktown sealed victory for the Franco-American alliance over the British Army and brought the War of Independence to an end. A third of the soldiers involved were German-speaking, earning it the name the German Battle. Daniel survived. After the war, his regiment was demobilized. On the long march away from the front, he encountered a world unlike any he had known.
One thing that astonished me was that here, no white men work. All the labor is done by black people. There are estates called plantations, and those who live there call themselves gentlemen. They all seem wealthy, dressed like noblemen every day of the week.
Blind to the suffering of enslaved Africans, Daniel saw in their toil an opportunity to escape the back-breaking fieldwork his father had known. His sense of wonder grew when he began to meet fellow countrymen in the New World.
There were marvelous reunions. A third of the regiment got to hug fathers, brothers, or sisters they hadn't seen in years. They asked about home, who was still alive. Hearing them speak my father's language, I felt like I was home.
After being demobilized, Daniel returned to Europe, but America never left his heart. A few years later, he crossed the Atlantic once more and settled in Virginia. Far from his native land, he became the owner of the farm he had long dreamed of, and ended his days as a pastor, preaching love for one's neighbor. Of the 30,000 German-speaking soldiers who fought, 12,000 never returned home. Some lost to war, others, like Daniel Flohr, chose to begin new lives on American soil. With British rule behind them, the United States began to rise as an economic power. In places like Pittsburgh, the steel industry boomed. Coal and iron mines, roaring blast furnaces, all demanded a growing army of labor. Industrialists raised wages to lure workers, and Pittsburgh became a magnet for Europe's working class. After the peasants and young conscripts of earlier generations, the late 18th century brought a new wave, skilled workers from the Rhine, drawn by the promise of America's Industrial Revolution. Among them was George Anschutz, Alsatian by adoption, born in the Saar Valley. Once deputy director of the prestigious De Dietrich iron mines, he made a bold decision in 1791 to leave everything behind and seek his fortune in the United States. In America, he found work in a factory, then launched his own business. Within 2 decades, he had become one of Pittsburgh's major steel producers, flooding the American market with his stoves, pots, and irons.
La vie d'Anschutz outre-Atlantique nous est connue.
Anschutz letters home to Alsace tell the story.
Resté en Alsace, il met en lumière les conditions de vie.
They tell of the favorable living conditions that allowed him to develop his business. High wages, a peaceful social life, and a booming economy.
Sociale paisible, une vie économique tout à fait dynamique, alors qu'en
In sharp contrast, life in Alsace between 1815 and 1818 was especially harsh.
ont été particulièrement éprouvantes pour les populations, notamment d'Alsace.
Devastated by the Napoleonic Wars, Alsace was struggling. Requisitions, blockades, and military occupation had crushed the local economy. George's success offered hope. Dozens of workers from the De Dietrich factories chose to follow his path to Pittsburgh, starting with his own brother. Pierre Anschutz, a forge worker, had lost his livelihood. George urged him to come. In 1817, Pierre applied for a passport to travel to America. The local sub-prefect was a close ally of the De Dietrich family.
La famille Dietrich est évidemment très liée avec les institutions locales.
Deeply tied to local institutions, the Alsatian elite, including the De Dietrichs, sought to prevent the exodus of their skilled workforce to America.
Leurs salariés, leurs ouvriers quittaient leur entreprise pour aller s'installer outre-Atlantique.
The French Revolution had upended the old order. In the 19th century, freedom of movement was now a legal right, enshrined in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. But while the authorities turned a blind eye, and even offered subtle encouragement to the departure of the poor or troublesome, they firmly resisted letting skilled workers emigrate. They feared that France's loss would be another nation's gain, that valuable expertise would fuel economic growth abroad, to the detriment of the homeland. So the prefect of the Bas-Rhine took action, asking the Minister of Police to block Pierre Anschutz's passport request. On March 14, 1818, the minister replied.
I am aware that, generally speaking, such emigrations have so far yielded unfavourable outcomes. But under current law, we have no authority to formally prohibit them, only to persuade. In Mr. Anschutz's particular case, however, his situation appears justified. He has just lost a job that supported his family, and he says he has a brother in America with whom he will likely find work and assistance. I see no objection to granting his request.
On est là dans une lecture tout à fait libérale de l'économie.
It was a very liberal interpretation of economic freedom. No citizen could be barred from leaving simply because they took their skills acquired in France with them.
Le savoir-faire qu'il a pu acquérir dans une entreprise du territoire français.
Pierre Anschutz was eventually granted passage to join his brother George in Pennsylvania. Over time, others followed in his footsteps. Carpenters, joiners, and glassblowers from the Dietrich factories set out across the Atlantic. Thousands of skilled migrants left to play their part in the American Industrial Revolution. Pittsburgh became the Steel City and the primary destination for German-speaking migrants from Rhineland, Hesse, and Swabia. They left a lasting mark. Even today, one of the city's neighborhoods is still known as Deutschtown, Germantown. In the early 19th century, as waves of migration from the Rhine continued, other German-speaking regions joined the exodus. Nearly 200,000 migrants, most bound for the United States. It was the dawn of mass migration. But now, a new land of promise beckoned. Brazil. In 1808, King João VI of Portugal and his royal court fled Napoleon's advancing armies. They sought refuge in Rio de Janeiro, which had become the capital of the United Kingdom of Portugal and Brazil. Now ruling from his wealthiest colony, the king aimed to unlock Brazil's vast potential. But a treaty with England demanded he dismantle slavery, and African slaves had been the main workforce in Brazil for over 2 centuries. Into this dilemma stepped a cunning entrepreneur, Sebastian Nicolas Gachet. He suggested a ready-made solution to the king: replace African slave labor with European workers. Sebastian Gachet had once dreamed of a military career, but a hunchbacked spine ended those ambitions. Undeterred, he climbed the social ladder, finding his way into the salons of the aristocracy. At a reception, he met the Portuguese ambassador. Claiming experience in Brazil's timber trade, Gachet proposed a bold plan: bring Swiss settlers. Their industrious nature would be exactly what Brazil needed. Sebastian wasted no time. He wrote to the government of Freiburg seeking official backing.
Your Lordships, the Portuguese ambassador has urgently recommended me to his government. I now humbly ask for your own support. Whatever the outcome, rest assured that I will always work to uphold the good name that the Swiss have earned abroad.
The Freiburg authorities saw in Gachet's plan a chance to ease rural poverty. In 1817, famine gripped Switzerland and much of the Rhine. The area was suffering from severe famine following a year without a summer. a climatic catastrophe caused by a volcanic eruption thousands of kilometers away.
In 1815, Mount Tambora erupted on the Indonesian island of Sumbawa. One of the most powerful eruptions of the first half of the 19th century, it had major consequences on the global climate. In Europe, the result was a month-long cold spell, which decimated crops in some areas, especially between 1816 and 1817. Switzerland, Württemberg, and Alsace were among the worst affected. A direct link can clearly be made between the eruption and the history of emigration.
Sebastian Gachet took advantage of the climate catastrophe. He secured 4,000 francs from Swiss notables to finance migrant transport to Brazil. Then, he signed an agreement with the Portuguese crown, which would cover the journey and provide land. The new colony would be called Nova Friburgo, New Freiburg.
A detailed 24-clause contract was drawn up. The Portuguese government would supply land, seeds, tools, and subsidies. From the outset, the plan included not just settlers in the form of farmers and artisans, but also soldiers to serve Brazil. The contract mentioned 100 families, but many more arrived. Instead of the 800 people expected, over 2,000 came. People were clearly very keen to leave Europe. And Gachet became the link between this new tide of European migration and Brazil's hunger for settlers.
Sebastian earned a tidy sum for each migrant. But the ships were not designed for so many passengers. They were crammed in with their belongings, treated little better than cargo. Worse still, to avoid spending his profits on clean drinking water, Gachet supplied them with contaminated water.
8 ships sailed from the Netherlands to Brazil in 1819 to establish the colony. Of the 2,000 who departed from the Dutch port, only around 1,600 reached Rio. Many died during the voyage. On the largest ship, the Urania, there were 100 deaths alone.
When the ships reached the Bay of Rio de Janeiro in November 1819, the migrants received a warm welcome. For the first time, the Swiss tasted oranges, bananas, and cachaça, sugarcane alcohol. But the respite was short-lived. Left to fend for themselves, the migrants had to walk the 180 kilometers from Rio to Nova Friburgo in the middle of the rainy season, carrying their luggage. Carts got stuck in the mud, animals slipped. In every village they passed through, locals offered help, lending them mules to climb the mountain passes. When they finally arrived, the Swiss found their ordeal was far from over. They were 1,682 people squeezed into barracks, built for 800. They were left to their own devices, and agricultural tools were lacking. It was not long before epidemics broke out. Within 16 months, 123 migrants had died.
Within a year, some migrants had already begun to flee. Many died or fell ill. Corruption and mismanagement strangled the colony's development. Many families left for Rio or elsewhere.
A large share of the government funds, hundreds of thousands of francs, never reached the settlers. Sebastian Gachet stood accused of getting rich at their expense. An investigation was opened. He tried to defend himself, but in the end, he was cast out, disgraced and penniless. Brazil's first European settlement had failed, but the idea was not abandoned. In 1822, Brazil declared independence. José Bonifacio, advisor to the young Emperor Dom Pedro, proposed a new strategy: bring in more Europeans, especially Germans, to settle and develop the untapped southern territories. Bonifacio believed their farming and industrial skills could help civilize the native nations, whom he referred to as savages, and help secure the country's borders. On July 25, 1824, the colony of São Leopoldo was founded. Bonifacio brought in artisans, farmers, and soldiers to form a colony that was both rural and military. Within just a few years, more than 11,000 Germans had settled there. This is a story Rodrigo Tresbach knows well.
I'm a descendant of German immigrants who arrived in Brazil in 1825. They came from villages near Frankfurt, which at the time were part of the Grand Duchy of Hesse. My ancestor, Friedrich Dresbach, was a carpenter. He came with his wife, 5 young children, and 2 grown children.
Though they defended the country and worked the land, German migrants, to whom the authorities had promised naturalization, were never fully accepted as Brazilians. Authorities feared they might remain too attached to their homeland, forming isolated enclaves under foreign influence.
Most were not naturalized in the early years. That was the case for my ancestor, who served 4 years in the Brazilian army without ever being granted Brazilian citizenship. Many of these immigrants couldn't participate in the country's political life. This alienation made integration difficult. They were considered foreigners, not nationals.
Despite being sidelined, most of the German migrants chose to settle permanently in Brazil. They built their own schools, printed newspapers in German, spoke their regional dialects of German, and often had no knowledge of Portuguese. Throughout the 19th century, they remained torn between love for their homeland and yearning to belong to their new country. In the United States, the population known collectively as the Germans exceeded some 500,000 people. With their earlier and more numerous arrivals compared to Brazil, German Americans laid claim to an identity as full citizens of the United States. They rejected the system of indentured servitude, which had kept many of them in near slavery conditions for decades. They now demanded to be recognized as full citizens. Their voice found a breakthrough moment in a landmark trial, the case of Sally Miller versus Louis Belmonte and John Miller in New Orleans in 1844. Sally Miller accused her owners of enslaving her, treating her as if she were African. She claimed another identity. She said she was the daughter of German immigrants and that her real name was Salome Müller.
This document I have here is the court transcript from the mid-19th century from the Louisiana Supreme Court. It traces the journey of a young girl named Salome Müller, and through it we learn about her family's migration story.
Your Honor, I, Sally Miller, born Salome Müller, a white woman residing in Lafayette, affirm that I was born to Bavarian parents who emigrated to this country around 1817. My mother died during the voyage. My father, my brother, my sister and I was barely 3 years old, were sold to a man named John Miller. My father died before we reached our destination. These facts I learned only later, for I was too young to remember them clearly.
They arrived in New Orleans in 1818 as redemptioners, migrants who had to find locals to pay off the cost of their passage. They were effectively auctioned off, not unlike enslaved Africans at the time. New Orleans was the largest slave market in 19th century America.
I was stripped of my rights and placed entirely under the control of this man, Miller. In defiance of both human and divine law, he reduced me to the condition of a slave, forcing me for many years to carry out every task and duty expected of those in bondage, degrading me in every way to the status of that oppressed class.
The case was brought forward by Madame Karl Ruf, a German woman living in New Orleans. She believed she had recognized Salome Muller working as a waitress in a cafe. Now called Sally Miller, she was being treated as a light-skinned slave. Outraged, Madame Ruf alerted the German-speaking community of Louisiana and urged Sally to take legal action against her owners.
With the support of local lawyers, Sally Miller filed a petition that led to a series of trials, reaching all the way to the Louisiana Supreme Court. She accused her current and former owners of wrongfully and immorally enslaving her, treating her as a black slave, despite her being a white European woman by birth. She argued that by the standards of the time, she should be free. At its core, the trial hinged on racial identity, especially the status of women, which was absolutely central to the definition of racial slavery at the time, as white women were seen as symbols of purity, in need of protection. Sally Miller's case was scandalous for the people of Louisiana and the Americans, as it suggested that the separation between blacks and whites was not absolute, but that one could be taken for a black when one was white, or vice versa. In a society that justified slavery through strict racial separation, this ambiguity was deeply unsettling. But Sally's case was far from isolated. Many light-skinned individuals were enslaved purely because they carried even a trace of African ancestry.
Other troubling cases followed, such as Rebecca, Charlie, and Rosa, white-skinned children born into slavery through mixed-race mothers. The public outrage wasn't aimed at slavery itself, but rather at the fact that white people could be mistaken for black slaves. For the German-speaking community, long accustomed to indentured servitude, the trial was a line in the sand. They refused to be equated with African slaves. They had never belonged to anyone, and now they demanded full recognition as citizens of the United States. Then came the twist. Sally's former owners presented the court with documents claiming she had lied, that she was born a slave, the daughter of an African woman, and had been purchased in Alabama. Doubt rippled through the courtroom, but her supporters stood firm. To the German community of New Orleans, she was now one of their own. And faced with overwhelming public pressure, the court ruled. Sally bore all the physical traits of a white woman, and by the law of the time, she had to be set free. It was a victory for the entire German-speaking community, who, through the case, asserted their rightful place in American society. The German-speaking community in the United States continued to grow, and in 1846, it surged with the mass arrival of migrants fleeing one of the greatest famines in European history.
In 1846, a new food crisis swept the globe. The culprit? Potato blight, a fungus of American origin. Ireland was hit hardest, but the disease also spread rapidly across Europe on account of its large, dense potato fields.
The potato, a staple for Europe's poor, was wiped out. Ireland suffered worst. The famine killed 1 million people, and more than twice that number were forced to emigrate to the Americas. The disease also spread to the German-speaking regions, sparking a new wave of mass migration there. Hundreds of thousands of peasants were forced to flee their land. Among them was Mathias Scholtzen from Prussian Rhineland. Mathias sold his land and, with his wife and daughters, made his way to the city of Dunkirk, from where he planned to sail to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. A recruitment agent had sold him a dream of a vast land where he would quickly build a fortune, far from poverty and famine. But when he arrived in Dunkirk, he realized he had been scammed. No ship was waiting for him, and the passage to Brazil cost 300 francs, the equivalent of a year's wages. Like so many other German migrants, Mathias found himself penniless, stranded at the port of Dunkirk. Moved by their plight, a German teacher named Monsieur Hohagen stepped in. He offered to act as their interpreter, organized a fundraising drive, and published an appeal in the press on July 17, 1846, calling on the authorities for help.
127 German emigrant families currently in Dunkirk are in the most wretched misery. They wander the streets, begging with hollow eyes. Some have been searching around sewers for scraps to ease their hunger. Others lie in the streets, half dead from starvation. I trust that they will not be left to suffer much longer, and that we will hasten to show them the fraternal compassion that ought to unite all men, regardless of nation.
The matter reached Paris, discussed at a meeting of the Council of Ministers. To prevent the situation from spiraling out of control, the Minister of War, in agreement with the Minister of the Interior, decided to send the Prussian refugees to Algeria. Once there, they would work as laborers or farmers to help develop France's newly established colony. On August 23, 1846, Mathias Scholtzen boarded a ship bound for Mels el Kebir, a port in a land he knew nothing about. France had begun its conquest of Algeria in 1830, but by 1846 it was still far from complete.
The fall of Algiers had been swift. The city surrendered within a month. But that victory did not mean France controlled all of Algeria. Far from it. Local tribes resisted fiercely, found leaders, and pushed back. The French military forces were relatively small, so for about a decade, French control over Algerian territory was limited to Algiers and its immediate surroundings. Algerian resistance was fierce and widespread, posing serious challenges for the French army. By the 1840s, France had deployed over 100,000 soldiers to suppress the uprising. This greatly influenced the placement of the first colonial settlements, which were always located behind the front lines of the military campaigns.
By the early 1840s, General Bugeaud was in charge of suppressing the resistance led by Emir Abdelkader. He employed scorched earth tactics, burning villages and crops, and even smoking out caves where Algerians had sought refuge. He supported a policy of military colonization involving soldier farmers, and viewed negatively the arrival of Prussian refugees in 1846. He considered them too weak and unable to defend themselves. In a report to the Minister of War, Bugeaud wrote,
Minister, I welcomed the arrival of the Prussians with great reluctance. I had assumed, since they were not allowed to board for America, that these families were poorly selected and particularly destitute. Alas, my suspicions fell far short of the reality. Words cannot convey the anguish I experienced on seeing these pitiful wretches. I beg you, Minister, for the sake of France and our colonists, let no more convoys of families from beyond the Rhine be admitted without rigorous screening.
After 13 days in a ship's hold, Mathias Scholtzen and his fellow migrants finally disembarked at Mers el Kabir. They arrived with nothing. The French army provided them with clothes, bedding, cooking utensils, and medicine. They were taken to Lastidia, a village at the edge of France's military zone, an outpost of colonial conquest. From that moment, they no longer treated them as refugees, but as colonists. Each family was assigned an identification number. The very next day, they were expected to start work, building the first huts.
It was fertile land for the Algerians, who mourned its loss, having been pushed aside to make way for the European settlers. But for the newly arrived European families, farming in this environment was nothing like the fields they had known. A single failed harvest could spell disaster. Their bodies were weakened by sun exposure or disease. Many of them soon felt abandoned because aid was limited and temporary, and rarely enough.
One by one, the migrant families sank into misery and starvation. When Mathias Scholtzen's wife died of exhaustion, he decided to leave Lastidia with his daughters, hoping to find a better life in nearby towns. The year 1848 would become a turning point in world history. In America, it marked the start of the gold rush. In France, it brought the abolition of slavery in its colonies. Across Europe, it was the year of the Spring of Nations, when the misery of the working class ignited into open rebellion. Amid all these upheavals, whether in the United States, South America, or even the colonies of Africa, the number of German-speaking migrants continued to grow.